Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Keith Preston and Logos to discuss what happened to the anti-war movement. Now, this sort of question can be seen in a couple of stages. During the Bush era, with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, on the left there was a robust resistance to the wars, and then once Obama was elected, that rapidly faded away, which led to many libertarians or paleo conservatives or observers just saying it was more of an anti-Bush movement than an anti-war movement. But if we go further back to Vietnam, the left-wing protesters were protesting left-wing presidents, so it wasn't just a partisan issue since Johnson and was being protested at the time. So, but we look at it now in the 2020 election, and I think this is where it's really sort of attenuated, is that Biden himself has, at least to my knowledge, all the recent wars the United States has been in over the last 60 years, he's signed off on. And now he's hired Bush-era foreign policy advisors, I think including Bush's vice president or former vice presidential candidate. And all of these people who used to be anti-war, anti-Bush, are now totally okay with Biden using Bush appointees. And then this just leads to the question, where did the anti-war movement go? What happened? So I think we'll start with you, Keith. What are some of your thoughts on where the anti-war movement went?
Well, there's a lot we could cover with this, obviously. But I think where I would start is with the question of why in the Vietnam War era you had this massive anti-war movement that emerged. And because I've heard some people say, well, there wasn't anything comparable to that for the Korean War in the 1950s. So why 15 years later was there a massive anti-war movement during Vietnam? And I think it had to do with the convergence of factors. One of them was the fact that the Vietnam War was a draft war, which there was not in Iraq. Now, that had been the case in Korea, but it was not the case with Iraq and some of the more recent wars. So a lot more people felt personally impacted by it. Another thing was that the 1960s was a time period in which there was very rapid social change, and for whatever reasons, people were questioning a lot of conventional ways of doing things. And I actually think that has to do with the affluence that emerged in the 1950s. For instance, until the scarcity problem, the problem of material scarcity, food and shelter and all those things, had largely, I wouldn't say gone away, but been greatly dissipated in Western countries, you didn't see nearly as much emphasis on these other things, on these other forms of cultural politics and social issues and things of that nature. It was only when the bread and butter issues had largely been resolved and you had an unprecedentedly large middle class in Western societies, it was only then that people started to pay a huge amount of attention to things like civil rights, gay rights, women's rights, environment, all of the different things that are associated with that, the politics of that time period, and which continue to shape politics of today. So you had those two things. You had the fact that it was a draft war, and the fact that you had this affluent culture that had time and resources to focus on other issues. And also the fact that the war in Vietnam was a war against communism. And or it was perceived as that, or it was sold as that by the policymakers. And if we go back and you look at who led and organized the anti Vietnam War movement, you clearly had people from the hard left who were leading and organizing this. Now, the movement itself attracted people from all over the political spectrum and a lot of different walks of life. It wasn't just hippies and college students as it's often portrayed. By the time that the war movement was anti-war movement in the 60s was at its peak, you had old ladies and blue collar workers and all kinds of people involved. But it is true that if you look at the actual leading anti-war organizations and who the leading anti-war people were, a lot of them came from the hard left, who not only opposed the war. You did have some like that. You did have some that were pacifists, AJ Musty types and all of that. but you did have plenty of others who were against the war in Vietnam because they were in favor of the Viet Cong, or they had a favorable view of the Maoist foreign policy view, of Maoist China, which positioned China as the ostensible vanguard of the third world against Western imperialism and this idea that the second world, the Soviet system, had become social imperialist. So you had people that had strong organizational and ideological motivations on one hand. You had an incentive for large numbers of people to participate because of the draft, and then you had a context of cultural and economic circumstances that fueled that at the time. So you had this convergence of circumstances. The left-wing anti-war movement was still around in the 80s during the time of the Central Wars in Central America. And it was largely there for the same reason. It wasn't nearly as large because of there was no draft or anything like that. There were not American troops generally who were directly fighting in Central America. But the anti-war movement in the 80s pertaining to Central America was led by the same kinds of people that led the anti-Vietnam War movement, and often the same individuals. It was a mixture of far left radicals and religious pacifists and people with those kinds of outlooks. By the time that we get to the Gulf War in 1991, one thing that I noticed that during that time when that was going on was that you had luminaries of the anti-war movement from the 60s who did an about face and were starting to have a favorable view of the American intervention in the Persian Gulf. I mean, I'm talking about figures like George McGovern, who was the Democrats' anti-war candidate in 1972, Andrew Young, who was a prominent civil rights leader, Tom Hayden, who was one of the Chicago Seven. A lot of those guys expressed a more favorable view of the Iraq War. And the reason for that was this wider Wilsonian doctrine of collective security and stuff like that. So this idea of a community of nations, and you have international law where war is criminalized and that kind of thing. So Saddam Hussein was perceived as this international aggressor. Now, that wasn't my perspective then as now. My perspective was that, first of all, as far as the war in the Persian Gulf in 1991, it was a localized war that Americans really didn't have any, that most Americans really didn't have any stake in, and therefore there was no reason to be involved in it. Just as what I would say about the Vietnam War is that it was largely a civil war. There was no Vietnamese fighting in the American Civil War in the 1860s. But that's not really the framework that a lot of these left-wing so-called anti-war people use. They're more against wars if it's perceived to be a reactionary war against progressive forces, but then there'll be for wars that they perceive of as progressive, and however they define that at a particular time. Now, when we get to the George W. Bush era, what we see there is we see some vacillation from the left. That some people on the left started to embrace the war in Afghanistan as a war against Islamofascism. Christopher Hitchens sort of epitomized that. This kind of left Trotskyite war against Islamofascism or feudalism or whatever. But then there was this massive anti-war movement against the war in Iraq. And at the time, you had localities with left-leaning local governments and things like that issuing declarations opposing the Iraq War and all these kinds of things. And all of that just completely went away in 2010. And I think that the only real, it went away in 2008 when Obama was elected, but by 2010 it was largely non-existent. And I think the reason for that is the anti-war movement of the first decade of the 21st century was largely an anti-Republican movement. This was something that was being utilized as a means of simply attacking the Republican administration. And then all of a sudden, when Obama came in, who was viewed as progressive, first black president, wanted to have health care reform, all the usual stuff, environmental legislation, all of a sudden being anti-war was something that was of no longer any interest. And you had people saying, well, we don't want to undermine the first black president, or we want to get these other things done. Even though Obama's foreign policy was arguably even more expansively imperialist than George W. Bush's. Obama expanded the drone wars. He implemented the so-called killed list. He, while George W. Bush had Afghanistan and Iraq, Obama continued those two wars. He also created two others in Libya and in Syria. Um, and not to mention the expansion of the American military presence in Africa and military efforts there. So Obama was just a simply part two of the Bush administration. Really, a great deal of continuity between Obama and Bush, and yet the perception had completely changed among anti-war people. In fact, I've noticed that since the early 2000s, at least, maybe even further back than that, the only faction in American politics that tends to be consistently opposed to American wars are the far right. The various factions of the far right, not the mainstream Republican leaning right, but all the things that are labeled as the far right. And I think the reason why is increasingly they consider the American government to simply be their enemy, period. And therefore they're not going to support anything that it does. But I think that's really how we've gotten to the place we are now. As to why more people are not interested in this, I think it's largely the fact that they just don't feel impacted by it. Uh, the only people who are really impacted directly by American foreign policy in a visible, tangible way are people in the military or people who have, say, close relatives or spouses or something that are in the military. But if you're not in the military or close to someone in the military, you don't really see this as something that's impacting you personally. In fact, most people don't even know about it. Whenever I talk to people about, say, what's going on in Yemen, they don't even know what Yemen is. They've never heard of Yemen. And I think that's the real issue that right there.
Yeah. Okay. So Logos, what's sort of your take on where the anti-war movement's gone?
Yeah, I don't know as much about the individual revolutionary movements as Keith does. The only thing I can really comment on is basically what I've seen from the media over the past 20 years. So, I mean, when I was a kid, you'd watch CNN, you'd watch MSNBC on the left, you'd watch Fox on the right. You had the smattering of media outlets, but even the central ones, the ones that were supposedly centrist, like CNN, they basically cheerleaded us into the wars, both Afghanistan and Iraq. And a lot of my peers, basically that I grew up with, knew that something was up. And that changed pretty, that carried on for quite a bit until basically Obama got elected. Now, what started happening around the time that Obama got elected? Well, two things. First, the media started taking this stance where any criticism of Obama was basically a racist criticism. Oh, you're saying like he's a black president. It's like, never mind the fact that people criticize things from Bush, who was a white guy, for the same reasons, right? That's one thing. The other thing, too, is they actually started silently getting rid of anti-war anchors that were on these networks. I can think of several that moved over to RT, had their own private YouTube channels and so forth because they got basically canned from mainstream media. So it's kind of like this two-pronged attack to carefully curate the types of media people were allowed to see, the types of media anchors they were allowed to listen to. And until they had this cabal of basically yes men in the media for the government. And it's not just the wars either. I mean, this you can see how this blends in with Edward Snowden and other issues where the government gets spying on citizens and things like that. These kind of overlap, and it's like the same things, the same reasons. Basically, these things were kind of like curated out of the media conversation very slowly. So through the Obama years, you were very, very unlikely to hear about these kinds of things that were happening. So when a Doctors Without Borders hospital got bombed in Yemen, mum's the word. Almost nobody talked about it, especially on the mainstream. You had to look at far left commentators to hear anything about it. So the kind of more mainstream far left people you might hear it from would be like a Kyle Kulinski, a secular talk person. He covered that when it happened. Jimmy Dore, the Young Turks, people like them. But if you really wanted to get in the nitty gritty of it, you usually have to watch like Russia Today, because that's where they had a ton of the really far left anti-war progressive shows that weren't just, I think, like, anti-reactionary war, but did protest them all, like, in principle. That's where you get like the Empire Files. That's where you get, Tom Hartman's show, which focused on anti-war and economics when I used to watch it a long time ago, and shows like that. So while these anchors were kind of pushed off the sidelines where nobody kind of watched on the internet, this kind of consensus was manufactured, basically, where people just didn't really care about stuff like that. And increasingly, the other thing the media did is, instead of leaving a vacuum of stuff they didn't cover, they would also move in a bunch of stuff they wanted to cover instead. So that's where you started seeing like racial politics brought up a lot more. That's where you start seeing emphasis on school shootings when they happened a lot more. Instead of local stories, school shootings are now just big time national news. I was talking with one of my friends who said one of the introduction, the first 24-hour news cycle was Columbine. I don't know if that's true, but it sounds plausible. And so you see capitalization on a lot of like individual acts in the country and policy discussions around that. So gun policy, race policy, all this stuff started happening. In Obama's second term, that's where you start slowly seeing the rise of things like Black Lives Matter and movements like that started dominating the media stream, taking small time things that happen in the country and blowing them up. So that's the big media discourse. And all of the international stuff that generally would be like, CNN is like a national news outlet. You'd think it'd specialize in like national events, federal events, things like that, leave local events to local stations. But no. So that's the two-prong attack they did. Carried out the stuff you don't want to talk about slowly over time, and then replace it with a bunch of stuff blown up in 24-hour news cycles that you do want to talk about. And that was a 1-2 punch for people, because people that I grew up with that were like, yeah, screw the media, they've been lying us in these wars. Yeah, screw these people, were eventually wrapped in to the issues of the day. And now suddenly, like, those sides of the talking points were all they really cared to talk about. And it wasn't like an overnight thing. This was like gradual. This happened, very subtly through the Obama administration. And as I pointed out, again, another good example of this would be the Standing Rock protests. This isn't just an anti-war thing. This also happened to other things the far left actually cared about. So the mainstream media didn't really cover the Standing Rock protests. I mean, I saw some minor things. It's like, okay, yeah, some people are mad about a pipeline being put in some part of somewhere in America. Not really going into it, but if you go to like the really further left channels, they would cover like stuff the police were doing to the protesters. They would cover some of the really nasty stuff that was going on, how likely this pipe was to burst into the lake. I know one of the pipes they did push through actually did burst over the lake after it was built, which sucks, but it's kind of like an I told you so moment. But, anyway. So stuff like that was going on, not just the anti-war stuff, but tons of things the left cared about was, ironed out of the media in the exact same way, in the exact same fashion. And you could do a diagnosis on any one of these things and figure out exactly, how it happened. It's basically the same cause every which way. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say on the intro for that one.
Yeah, some of the reasons I think that can be adduced as well as Keith pointed out. The origin of the anti-war movement was heavily wrapped up in the draft. And once the draft was eliminated, and the United States found ways to go to war without having to mobilize the whole country or large part of the country, you could essentially have a forever war and nobody cares, because the only people fighting are those people that quote unquote chose to fight. And furthermore, because of improvements in financing and production, we no longer have to have shortages. We no longer have to have rations. So things that in World War I or World War II, you'd have to have rations and buy bonds. And it'd be, I don't think on the home front you could eat butter and stuff because that was going to the troops. Stuff like that would be a real onerous imposition for a war that goes on 10, 20 years. But if you can produce enough guns and butter to meet everybody's needs all the time, and you then remove the burden of fighting from those who don't want to fight only to those who do, then you sort of neutralize the sort of main impulse that motivated the original anti-war movement. I think another reason too is if we look at a lot of the rise of libertarian and pro-capitalist thinking, say after Occupy Wall Street, where they sort of turn the tables on the radical labor left, there's this sort of increasing interconnectedness argument that the economies are all interconnected. It's, again, the same globalist rhetoric of earlier years, but it's more sophisticated and it's better packaged and it's more convincing to most people. And it's pretty clear that the United States Armed Forces are the only reason why we have these international trade networks. If the U.S. Navy were to go away, piracy would flourish and choke off trade. If the U.S. Army went away, then the Middle East would just kind of, I mean, it already is blowing up, but we wouldn't have access to the oil. It'd be blowing up without anybody having access to the oil. And so I think deep down, a lot of people really know that if we pulled out of all these countries and stopped policing the world, then the global economy would undergo a massive contraction, which would, they don't want to lower their standard of living. They don't want to lower their material conditions. They like their material conditions. And if it means, the U.S. supporting terror groups in Yemen or, bombing people in Libya, well, I mean, hey, you got my iPhone. It's not, what do I care about that? And then also this ties into, this is riffing off Logos a little bit more. When we look at the news cycle, and especially now with social media and digital platforms, even more so than when it was televised under the Bush administration, if something isn't in your feed, then it just doesn't exist. So there's a twofold problem here. First of all, these social media giants tailor your feed to your preferences. So if you don't want to hear about foreign policy issues, if you don't want to hear about these wars, you don't. And then they might as well not exist. And that's not saying that isn't in someone else's feed, because maybe it is. But then there's the further problem of some things just aren't, quote unquote, fit to be published, full stop. And it's not even a matter of feed selection. It's just a matter of not getting reported on at all. And so I think a combination of the fact that most people don't have to either suffer directly or indirectly at a war, don't have to take any economic hits from the war, aren't willing to lower their standard of living in the absence of a global interconnected economy, and the way the social media giants have sort of created this impression of reality. I mean, it's really the movie Wag the Dog. I mean, they can just kind of make up any reality they want, and people are going to believe it. And so as long as you don't talk about this kind of stuff, it just never comes up. Keith, do you have anything more to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with most of that. I would say that one thing that the one impact that the Vietnam War had that I think has been very durable is this. I think that it delegitimized imperialist war in the eyes of most Americans, if any sacrifices are required on their side. And that gets to all the things you were talking about. There hasn't been a war since Vietnam that was a draft war. Not only that, but there are no special war taxes that are imposed when there's a war. They just pay for it all through debt, rather than raise taxes or impose special taxes for the wars. As you were saying, they don't ration any essential goods or anything like that. We don't have blackouts or any war drills or anything like of that nature that people find disruptive or inconvenient. It's really, since Vietnam, war is just something that takes place on television. It's just something you watch on TV. It's like a TV show or something, almost like sports or like video games or something. For that reason, most people don't feel impacted by it. And I think the system knows that. I think the system knows that on one hand, the public is not going to accept a war that imposes any sacrifices on them. On the other hand, they don't really care if there's no sacrifices required. In fact, there are some anti-war people who've argued that abolishing the draft was actually a bad idea because it made the public more willing to accept war if it doesn't require any sacrifices on their side. Now, I actually don't agree with that argument. I would have. I can only imagine what would have happened if George W. Bush and his associates had a conscript army of tens of millions of people. If we had the kind of military force that we had during, say, World War II, we have American troops literally stationed everywhere in the entire world. We'd be like the Roman Empire. Well, we are like the Roman Empire, but even that on steroids. So I think that that's a big part of it. People just aren't interested in this if it doesn't affect them, and the people who make the policies, who make the war policies, understand this. Also, the media, I think, plays an important role in this because they realize that if they report on aspects of American foreign policy that are particularly unsavory, that is going to make the system look bad, and that's not what they want. Um, if you compare the mainstream American media with the foreign media, uh, certainly the foreign media that originates from countries that are hostile to the United States. For example, if you look at Russia Today or China, the Chinese media, or Press TV, which is Iranian, or Telesur, which is Venezuelan, or even Al Jazeera, which is Qatari. All of those channels portray American foreign policy in a much, much, much worse way than any American media does. And even the European media, which is ostensibly, those countries are ostensibly American allies, but even there you see far more criticism of American war policy than you do in the U.S. media. And I think that the U.S. media has largely realized that the way that they can control opposition to war is to simply not talk about it. One of you mentioned news anchors that were fired for criticizing American wars. One prominent one was Phil Donahue. MSNBC, supposedly the big liberal or left-leaning channel, fired Phil Donahue back during the Iraq War era for his Iraq War stance, anti-Iraq War stance. So they've very subtly and quietly just culled the media of any serious anti-war voices, and the rest of them simply don't talk about foreign policy issues. Whenever I see foreign policy issues covered, say on CNN or one of those, if you watch Fox, I mean, they're clearly just neocon mouthpieces. But if you watch, say, CNN or MSNBC or one of the ones that are supposed to be in the middle, like ABC or CBS, they always cover foreign policy issues in a very superficial way. It's always one that supports the state's general narrative. It's never anything that's critical in any significant way. It holds to this framework that the Americans are the good guys, that this is somehow about advancing democracy or human rights or whatever else against bad guy terrorists and dictators and all these other things. And that's the general narrative everyone gets. So everyone gets this narrative that, well, okay, American foreign policy really isn't that bad, or it would be worse if the Americans didn't do what they did, or it doesn't matter because I'm not affected by it personally. Also, another thing that I find interesting, I think any discussion of the anti-war movement has to include this. One thing that I find interesting is that if we look at all the cultural upheaval that took place in the 1960s, many of the figures that are associated with that are now considered iconic figures. In the case of Martin Luther King, for example, we've got a national holiday named after him. Malcolm X, they've made movies about him. Harvey Milk, who was a early gay rights figure. I think there is or was a postage stamp commemorating him. And Gloria Steinem is the pioneer modern or second wave feminist, is an iconic figure. But I've never noticed that figures from the anti-war movement are treated in the same way. I don't know of any statues or streets or schools that are named after anti-war people from the Vietnam War era, or postage stamps or any of these kinds of commemorative things. For example, Abby Hoffman or somebody like that. In fact, even when figures like that are dressed, say, in popular culture or in nostalgic historical remembrances or something, there's always this means of de-emphasizing some of the things they were actually saying. They're always presented as, well, they were just folks that were for civil rights and, thought world peace was a good idea or something like that. And I think that there's a reason for that. I think that all these other things, civil rights, gay rights, feminism, environmentalism, are much more easy to accommodate by the system than the anti-war outlook is. I think that the people who really control the system look at it like, okay, we can accommodate these other things. We can integrate more and more population groups into the system as workers and consumers and taxpayers and members of the military and all that, when it comes to race and gender and gay rights and all those things. But I think they look at it like the anti-Vietnam War movement was an embarrassment. They look at it like it was a time when there was a popular uprising against the state over an aggressive imperialist war, and the state essentially had to back down. The state essentially had to back off. And I think that they don't want a repeat of that. And I think that they have very carefully created a situation where they can avoid that in the future by having an all professional military, ending the draft, fighting wars with proxy armies through client states with technology and drones and all of that, covert actions, and also by simply ignoring war within the context of public commentary, simply keeping it out of the media to a large degree, eliminating journalists to try to call attention to any of this stuff. And I think that's how we've gotten to where we are now.
Logos, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, between you and Keith, you're getting up a big percentage of the topic here. You're doing a great job. One thread I think might be interesting to pull on a little more that caught my attention when both you were talking was both you mentioned the debt and how we're able to offload most of the immediate costs of war onto the national debt. Now, that's actually really, really interesting because, like you said, immediately it doesn't impact people's lives. But something else I've noticed as well is that a lot of quote unquote more right wing or conservative people that tend to be anti-war talk about how it harms the national debt. I'm talking about, Rand Paul, Ron Paul, though their rough constituency in the Republican big tent, they'll often talk about how, war is bad for the debt. It has military waste and all this. One of the things I think that has hurt the right wing anti-war movement from their angle is they talk about regulating the debt and any of the wars to do so, but what they also bundle with that is usually austerity measures and things like that, ending certain social programs and stuff to end the debt as well. Now, if a right-wing challenge to the war machine movement can always just be conflated by the media or by anybody else as just some challenge to social programs and austerity and stuff like that that people actually do like, it's a way to poison the well and delegitimize the thing that they might be right about, the delegitimizing the war. And this also blends into what Keith was just talking about social issues. It's very easy for the system to accommodate, gay rights and the war on poverty and social welfare programs, all these things, just kind of, shuffle the paper around, keep things moving. And it turns out some people really like that stuff, social security and people like, things like that. Polls very, very, very well. So anything that an anti-war movement does that would appear to conflate itself or leave itself open to be conflated with by the media, an avenue to cut off a popular program, they'll do it. So Trump has done a lot of anti-war stuff. I mean, not the best at it. He just fired some recent Pentagon people. I know 150 of Bush's National Security Board resigned and wrote this public support of Joe Biden. He's not as anti-war as I'd like Trump, but he's angering all the right people. I can at least give him that much credit. But what's interesting is that that's not talked about by the left as much as his comments about, trans people serving in the army of all things, or, his comments about Mexico, or his comments about other certain racial politics, So the left very much tries to take any right-wing anti-war movement and conflate it with some other popular things and see, look at what these bad people don't like. You should not like these bad people. And I think they've been very, very, very successful of that, either because the movements open themselves up to it, like the Pauls, or rhetorically might open themselves up to it, like, say, Trump. But what's interesting is if you look at how left-wing anti-war people are actually approaching this, like, say, a Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders knows full well that as long as the debt keeps hiding the cost of war in the background, people aren't going to feel the immediate effects. So what many people on the left, the Kyle Kalinskis, the Jimmy Dores, the Bernie Sanders, have been saying, and Trump even picked up on this during the primary in 2016, what they've been saying is, well, let's look at the laws of opportunity cost, right? If we're already going into debt, we're already very happy going into debt, let's think about all the other things we could spend all this debt on aside from the wars. Now, that's a pretty interesting thing. And if an anti-war movement's going to pick up steam, I think that's like the best argument it can make, because you're not paying directly through rationing or whatever, but imagine the stuff that the debt could give you instead of giving the military. So the more those tactics get adopted and the more tactically they're adopted, so they can't be conflated with other unpopular issues as well, I think that would be the best shot at a good anti-war movement happening.
Yeah, one actually good point brought up by someone in the chat, Puss in Boots, was that since everything is all the tribal identities are so divided, they're very precarious. They're just trying to survive. Everybody's sort of, partly because of the media cycle pitting everybody against each other, divide and conquer. Everybody feels threatened by everybody else. And we see this most extremely with their neighbors with like COVID. Oh, you're not wearing a mask. You must be trying to kill me. And so we've got all these different tribal affiliations where people are feeling besieged, right? I think you would probably agree, Keith. Almost all these people feel they're being besieged at some level. And that siege mentality is sort of putting them in survival mode. And survivor mode, you're not really thinking about much of anything else. Another thing that puts people in survivor mode is the fact that over the last 30 years, we've been the population has been told to get into debt to buy things they don't need, that they can't afford. And now that everybody is essentially underwater, and if you get fired from a job, that's bad. That would be bad in any situation. But now it's catastrophic because you might get evicted from your home. You might lose your car because you can't make the payments for these things you bought that you don't need, that you can't afford. And so all of these financial pressures and intertribal dispute pressures and the broader sense of ennui in society is putting people in this sort of like fight or flight survival mode where they're not really thinking about anything beyond tomorrow. And in part, that's the result of a certain set of material conditions that they're living in. And it's almost certainly intentionally been constructed this way so that people will be so busy infighting and worried about the future that they can't organize or do anything else. What are your thoughts on that, Keith?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about leads into several other points that I think are important. One of them is that when we look at this from an economic angle, Jason Unruh, the Maoist rebel guy on YouTube, whom I disagree with about quite a few things, but one point that he raised a few years ago was this. He said that Americans are the 1%. If you look around the world at average per capita per person income, of all the people who would be in the top 1% worldwide in terms of income level, half of them would be Americans. So 50% of the global 1% are in the United States, and most of the rest of them are in Europe or East Asia, like in Japan and South Korea. Anyone in the United States who has an income of about $50,000 a year is in the global 1%. I think the median income in the U.S. is still about $50,000 a year. That's before taxes and all that. So anyone that earns $50,000 a year or up is in the global 1%. The issue with that, the point that Jason Unruh was making is that Marxists who think that there's going to be a Marxist revolution in the United States are crazy, because people who are in the global 1% don't have plenty to lose other than their chains. They're not immiserated proletarians of the 19th century. But I think that on one hand, that is an issue in the sense that you have enough people in the United States, probably about half the population, who are well off enough that they don't really see the need to care about anything else. They're part of the global 1%. And then the other half are the parts that are sinking. You have the sectors of the U.S. population that are rapidly becoming re-proletarianized, as I call it. That is, they're sinking into what is like a 19th, 20th century, early to mid 20th century proletariat, prior to the economic expansion of the mid 20th century. So increasingly, you have a society in the United States of people who only care about their class position, either because they're fading fast and they're trying to hold on, or they're on the bottom trying to get by, or they're higher up than that, but they don't want to sink, or they're simply too rich to care, as the common phrase often goes. So I think that's a big reason, economic reason, why we don't see any more attention to war-related issues than we do. And I think the culture war definitely feeds into it. more and more, it seems to me that the two major sides in the culture wars, which are really just coalitions of tribes, many of whom dislike each other, the only thing they have in common is they hate the so-called other side more than they hate each other. But you have these two coalitions of tribes who more and more see each other as existential enemies. To the point that if the other side wins an election, it's not a legitimate election. You have in this election, this recent one, of course, you have people claiming it was fraudulent. Trump got cheated out of victory. You had the same thing going on in 2016. And in 2016, you had people on the blue team saying that the Electoral College should overturn the results of the election and make Hillary president instead because Trump was so unfit. So all of a sudden the Electoral College became a good thing in their view. So, I think this points to something wider, and that is that the two sides see each other increasingly as an existential threat. And I've noticed this in my conversations with people. For example, a couple of years ago, including people with supposedly radical views and that kind of stuff. A couple of years ago, I did an interview with a left anarchist podcast. And these were actually some of the better people that I've encountered in the left anarchist milieu. But while I was doing the podcast, one of them asked me. They said, what would you say is the most important issue in the United States, or something that anarchists should be most concerned with? And I said, well, definitely American imperialism, definitely American foreign policy. I mean, the body count that generates is pretty enormous, and more attention should be paid to that. Well, sometime later, they actually refused to air the interview they did with me on their channel because they thought it was too controversial or whatever. But they did do a critique of it, and they said, well, they mentioned that I had said that, and they just treated that as a joke, like they were saying, well, why is that any more important than any other issue or whatever? And at the same time, these are people who get really worked up about anything that they think smacks of racism, or they were really into the whole Black Lives Matter and that whole thing, as if there's no people that aren't white being affected by U.S. foreign policy, which I think I don't even know if ignorance is the word to describe something like that kind of mindset or framework. It seems to me that it's more a type of tribalism that just simply sees anything that is supposedly not progressive or whatever as a mortal enemy from one side, from the left side, and you see parallels to that on the other side as well. For example, when Obama's war against Libya was going on, there was a lot more criticism of that from the right than from the left. And in fact, if you go back to the 1990s, Bill Clinton's war in Kosovo, there was a lot more criticism of that from the right than from the left. So they have this idea, I think the two sides have this idea that if a war is being waged by somebody who was a representative of their own side, well, it must be okay, or at least no big deal. Or if the other side is waging war, well, it's just no worse than anything else they do. For example, if Donald Trump is trying to escalate hostilities with Iran, well, that's no worse than, say, kids in cages or some of these other conventional talking points on the left. So I think that's a big part of this. The foreign policy issues, the war issues, get obscured by all these wider culture war issues within a framework of this kind of socioeconomic infrastructure that we have.
All right, Logos, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. The interesting thing I heard about that was the socioeconomics and income and things like that. I think America has reached a phase where it's about to be a victim of its own success, because we're quickly reaching a point where an income doesn't really say a whole lot about a person's socioeconomic status, in the sense that if you make $50,000 a year in, say, South Dakota, you might live very, very differently than if you make $50,000 a year in California, depending on where in California you live. Because the U.S. is splitting up into multiple nations. And really what's going on is the more plugged in globalist urban centers where the economy seems to be growing and booming, those are the places where you're seeing like wage price spirals, like massive ones. And so income is not a very good indicator of somebody's, how well off they are, because you could make 50,000 in California and half that could go to rent, easily. I've heard people paying $1,600 a month for small apartments in Long Beach or various parts of California. It's brutal. It's absolutely brutal. Whereas 50,000 a year in other parts can buy you a house. And this seems to be. I remember hearing in my international monetary theory course story about David Hume talking about this. The Spanish Empire went out and plundered the world and got a bunch of gold, brought it back to Spain. And what happened? Well, all the people in Spain were richer, but everything started costing more. And so it's almost like this weird thing where the more the empire globally solidifies the U.S. as a power, the more stuff is redirected through the U.S. The more wealth the U.S. gets, but also the more expensive everything in the U.S. starts getting, and that's where you're going to start seeing a lot more economic asymmetry and disparities, I guess, in the top and the bottom. The Rust Belt's going to start falling further and further away compared to the cities, but then again, people in the cities, it's crazy because you can see more income and wealth inequality just like in parts of California than you might even see between different parts of the U.S. because that's how insane city wealth organizing is getting. And what I think that's interesting and ties into the broader anti-war movement is increasingly, since the anti-war tended to be traditionally left, the left these days is more urbanite. And the more urbanite section of the left is either very, very, very well off and is caring about social issues. Like Keith said, a lot of Black Lives Matter people, Jonathan Butler, people like them, they're kind of like petite bourgeois. Their parents are worth like tens of millions of dollars and things like this. So they're not going to care much about the anti-war stuff. They're more into like the social issues. They want to do civil rights on the ground and things like that. And then other people in the cities that vote left are definitely hanging on for dear life, voting for economic issues because the cities are kind of being pulled apart economically speaking. Whereas if you look at places on the right tend to be more rural, or they tend to be like old factory towns if they're purple, like the Midwestern states and places like that, where they're anti-war in the sense that they're kind of anti-globalism in general. Trump's base is just very pessimistic of globalism entirely, which is also fractured the anti-war movement. And it's also allowed the left to play this other game that frustrates me to no end, where critiques of war and certain globalist institutions, the left will take, or at least the uncharitable charlatans in the left media will take to mean criticisms of cosmopolitan multiculturalism and it's racist, it's xenophobic, it's all these other things, when really some of these people, if you just listen to them talk, they're just going to tell you, here's the way in which this international order has been hurting me and I don't trust it to do what it's doing anymore, right? And that could be anti-war, that could be all sorts of things. But in the same way that the right wing under, say, the Rand Paulites and things like them, anti-war deficit spending rhetoric is conflated with austerity. Now you're seeing like anti-globalist rhetoric that's ravaging the cities in the way that it is, but also resulting in outsourcing things like that. That's being conflated with racism, xenophobia, and all sorts of social taboos. And that's another tactic they seem to be using, which is pretty effective, I guess, for the urbanites that stay plugged into the media. So that's one other thing that really worries me about all this.
All right, so Keith, why don't we move on to final statements? What do you want to end with?
Well, I think we've covered the basics of all of this, except one thing that I would say is interesting is that a lot of Americans, I think, really don't have any perception of the impact that their own state has on the rest of the world. The United States government really isn't just a government of a country. It's a world government, or I would say it's more like the senior partner in a global government. All of these John Bircher type people who for years have talked about, one world government is coming, the new world order, and we're going to be under the rule of the UN and all of that. Well, all of that is here, and it's been here for a while. And the way that it works is that you have this international network of power elites that transcends national boundaries, and which tends to be embedded in transnational institutions, whether it's international finance or multinational corporations or transnational political organizations or international treaties and bureaucracies and trade agreements and all these kinds of things that is the global government. I mean, we have a de facto global government. And in fact, we have a situation where political and economic and military and technological and cultural power are all increasingly being concentrated on a global level, on an unprecedented level. So, what we typically see is the American government and in collusion with its various partners extending this kind of system throughout, to the far corners of the world. Where now, on a cultural level, for example, you see McDonald's in the remote areas of the world and all of these kinds of things. In fact, there was a social science study done a few years ago that showed that McDonald's golden arches is now the most easily recognized symbol worldwide, even more so than the symbols of the different religions, like the cross or the crescent or the Star of David or any of those icons. So that's where we are now in terms of the distribution of power, and also if we want to look at just the sheer human costs, I would estimate that in the last 20 years alone, probably 1 million people have been killed as a result of American wars and foreign policies. I say it's easily in the hundreds of thousands. 1 million is probably sounds to me to be about right. And if you look at all of the deaths that have happened because of the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Libya, the war in Syria, all of which were either caused or initiated or greatly exacerbated by American policy, we see a very, very large body count there. And what I find interesting is that, as I said, nobody in the United States pays any attention to this. On the other hand, they will exaggerate other things. For instance, the Black Lives Matter movement is one. You'll see, to hear some of the commentary that comes from that milieu, you would think that every policeman that goes to work every day is just waiting for the opportunity to murder a black person or something like that. Now, I would say police brutality is a real issue. There are racial implications and disparities in that. I think the left blows it out of proportion while the right ignores it altogether. But I do think that it's an issue, but it's a drop in the bucket. I mean, it's not even that. It's a speck compared to the impact of American foreign policy on people all over the world.
Yeah, Logos, what do you want to end with?
Yeah, I agree with Keith that we've got all the basics. I think the only way I can probably tie this up in an interesting way, I hope, is just to come back to previous conversations we've had, Todd, about movements, especially often left-wing movements, that will start with a few issues that a lot of people will agree with, but then they'll start adding issues and get issue creep to the point where they can't get a broad coalition. And I think looking at the future of anti-war movements, I wonder if we can, if it's worth it to build a purely anti-war movement without any of the other things. So, for example, suppose that Trumpers and Bernie Sanders supporters and people like them can all come together, right, and say, listen, we know that you don't like globalism, people on Trump's side, and Bernie, we know you don't like corporations and stuff like that, but we can all agree that the war is causing a bunch of national debt issues that will put this off to the side. Now, if a bunch of the dissident movements on both the left, the right, and everybody else can come together like against the war machine and not deal with a bunch of other issues, I wonder how successful such an anti-war movement could be, especially if each side's allowed to hold their cards to their chest and say, here's why I want to end the war. They might have their own reasons for doing so, but as long as everybody seems to want to do it, if you can get a populist movement against it, it might be able to happen. But yeah, what seems to be tripping this up often is either it's on purpose or it's a tactical blunder or something else. Every movement at different sides of the political spectrum, like I've mentioned earlier, seems to want anti-war and something. So like the Rand Paul types, it's anti-war and austerity to deal with the debt. Well, austerity is popular, so we don't trust you libertarians. Okay. Bernie in 2016, I liked his interview with Ezra Klein on immigration. 2019, Bernie's still anti-war, but he also wants looser immigration restrictions. Well, I'm sorry, Bernie. I might like you on the war stuff. I don't trust you on the immigration. The Trump people, anti-war, and we don't like this whole globalism thing. Let's maybe close the borders and sort our economy out before this thing blows up like a bomb, which it very well might. Well, it's like, okay, Trumpers, we think you're overreacting about the globalist stuff. We're not really happy with your rhetoric there. And as long as each side has this and thing to attack on the anti-war movement, that keeps the other sides from going with it. I wonder if we're just going to stay stuck in this quagmire where each side says, "I would follow you if," but no side kind of follows through with anything. And I think that if the U.S. is serious about an anti-war movement, I think that's what it's got to start doing, is just stripping away all the rhetorical baggage and tactics that could be used against them, coming to the table to agree on this one thing, and hammering it out. Because I really do think that once we decrease the power of the military-industrial complex, once we start dealing with the power of wars and things like that, a lot of dominoes can start falling into play, because the elites will have a lot less of our government to control. And so I think we just win that one battle, like a lot of stuff starts unlocking basically for more change and better change. So I guess that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I guess what I'll end with is something that I've said multiple times in various other streams. Almost all of these social issues from the 60s were created by government agencies in order to divide and conquer the U.S. population, making it impossible to organize. And that's one of the things we've been talking about now. All this diversity makes organizing impossible. And I think and that's why all these quote unquote civil rights heroes are touted, except the anti-war ones. It's almost like they were too successful at restructuring things, and it almost got away from them with the anti-war movement, which they've since roped back in and neutered. But yeah, thanks again, Logos. Thanks again, Keith Preston. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off. Also, make sure to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell.